All right. Good morning, everybody. So in preparation for the loss prevention webinar later today, getting ready for an OSHA inspection, we decided to take a look at the top 10 most frequently cited violations by OSHA, in various categories. And so, when we looked at this, I also threw in a couple of things from SAR findings from previous years that are kind of common as well. That we'll look at to just remind you of some things that we want to look at when we're talking about preparation for an OSHA visit. And of course, before we really jump into this, I also want to add that it's not just about preparing for an OSHA visit, why we want to take a look at these things. Obviously, these are safety issues. These are serious safety issues. We want to make sure that we're compliant because that helps us make sure we have a safe work environment. And that's the ultimate goal. And that's why OSHA will come out and pay us a visit to help make sure that we have a safe work environment. And we want to have a safe work environment where we're free of any unnecessary accidents and hazards and so forth. So as we go through this, looking at last year's OSHA citations, the #1 cause of a citation for federal OSHA came from the 1926.501 standard on fall protection. There was a total of almost 7,000 violations written on this one standard alone, and it covers areas such as in construction, the requirement for fall protection when working at 6 feet or higher. As you can see, there were 4,252 violations on that specific part of the standard. There's also the walking surfaces where there's requirements for fall protection. If you're doing roofing activities on a low slope roof and the fall protection requirements on a low slope roof versus a steep roof, we see about 500 violations between both of those. And then the walking and working surface where you may have a hole or some other opening in the surface that you're walking on, the requirement for fall protection there. And of course that covers quite a few different things as far as having railings, having barriers around the openings, making sure you've got warning lines, making sure that you've got appropriate fall protection systems, fall arrest systems. And so all of those things are ones you would want to look at when assessing your fall protection program. If you're working at heights greater than 6 feet or 5 feet, depending on the situation, we need to make sure that we have taken into consideration what requirements are there for fall arrest systems or fall protection systems, railings and barriers and so forth. The next most commonly cited hazard was in the Hazard Communication Standard, 1910.1200. And that's one that we've actually talked about quite a bit. The Hazard Communication Program deals with your safety data sheets, and that program, which involves more than just having your safety data sheets. The most, as we can see with the Hazard Communication Program, there was about 4,600 violations or citations written on that particular program. And when we look at that, there's a requirement that you have a written hazard communication program. So the #1 cause of a citation being written in the hazard communication program is just lack of having the written program, that covers the various requirements of the hazard communication program. And remember, that involves multiple aspects: the written program, the training program, labeling program, having the safety data sheets, making sure they're available to employees, making sure we've done training on, the new symbols and the new safety data sheets and so forth. So there's a lot of pieces to that besides just having the safety data sheets available in your workplace. The next most common reason there was a citation on the hazard communication standard was lack of training specific to chemicals existing in the workplace. So we need to make sure that if we have hazardous chemicals in our workplace, that our employees receive training on those specific chemicals before they're working with those chemicals. Or if a new chemical is introduced, employees need to be trained on those chemicals beforehand. So about 1,200 citations on that aspect. The accessibility of the safety data sheets. Sometimes we'll come in and we'll ask to take a look at your safety data sheets, and they're locked away in a filing cabinet in the office. Well, part of the standard is that those have to be accessible and available to the employees in the workplace. And so that's a common citation as well. Making sure that your safety data sheets are complete and that there's sheets for all chemicals available in the workplace. And then making sure that we have, explanations and training on how we do our labeling and how we do make sure we have the safety data sheets that are most current available in our safety data sheet book. So those are the most common reasons we see citations associated with the hazard communication standard. The next most commonly cited issue for federal OSHA is the scaffolding. And maybe we don't use a lot of scaffolding in our operations, but we do see them from time to time, and this is a common thing. So if you have an OSHA inspector coming in and you've got scaffolding up anywhere around your facility, they're going to take a close look at that because this is a real common one. Federal OSHA wrote almost 3,700 citations last year on these scaffolding requirements. Examples of causes or reasons citations would be written would be no fall protection above 10 feet, where you have a lower level in the scaffolding that's greater than 10 feet below the current level. Also, having a secure access points to the scaffolding is another common cause. Not having the parts of the scaffolding planked or decked where that's necessary and required where you're working. Also, fall protection for all other scaffolding was kind of another one thrown in here. And some of these are kind of crossovers, just depends on where the inspector, what part of the code that they decided to cite when they wrote these citations. And the last most common aspect of a citation for the scaffolding standard is not having the scaffolding set up on a firm foundation or a firm base plate to make sure that that scaffolding is stable when we're on it. The fourth most common area where we see citations is in the respiratory protection program. And within that, we had about 3,400 violations last year. About 600 of those violations, the most common aspect of the respiratory protection program where citations were written was a lack of a medical evaluation. So if we do require respiratory protection, personal protective equipment for our employees, then we need to make sure that we have that annual medical evaluation being done. Another really common thing, like the hazard communication program, is not having the written program in place that's required, not doing an annual fit test, either not doing it or not doing it in an appropriate manner. And then there's also the voluntary use, allowing for voluntary use. What's that, Appendix D in the respiratory protection program as well. Sometimes there's some citations on that. And also making sure that your personal protective equipment that is selected, your respirators and so forth that are selected, are actually NIOSH approved respirators is another common area where we see violations on the respiratory protection program. Number 5 is the lockout tagout program. So we have about 3,000 violations on lockout tagout. Number 1 within that would be not having lockout tagout procedures identified for various pieces of equipment or processes within your operations. So that's something you need to make sure you do ahead of time, is look at your different equipment that may require a lockout at some point during maintenance, and make sure that you have the procedures for the lockout tagout on that specific piece of equipment identified ahead of time. Also, an annual procedural evaluation. Part of this standard requires that at least once a year we go through and take a look at what our procedures are for lockout tagout and verify that those are still the best procedures for the equipment that we're using, and make sure that we're following those programs. Not having a lockout tagout program would be the next most common reason for a citation in this category. Not doing your lockout tagout training, and not adequately giving notice to affected employees in the workplace who are maybe not directly involved in maintenance on the equipment, but are in the vicinity of the equipment, or who may be, maybe reasonably expected they may be using the equipment or try and use the equipment, making sure that those affected employees are notified as part of our lockout tagout program. Number 6 is ladder, violations of ladder standards. So this would fall under standard 1926-1053. about 2,500 violations here. On this one, we're looking at the most common one when you're using an extension ladder that goes up above a surface where you're exiting the ladder, that you need to have that 3-foot extension extending above the top of the level where you're exiting the ladder. Also, using ladders that are not designed for the purpose that they're being used for. Using the top rung as a step. Of course, we know on step ladders, you don't use those top rungs as steps. Having defective ladders in the facility and not having them disposed of, or not having them at least made so that they can't be used. That's a common citation here as well. And then not using the ladders on a stable surface would be another, less frequent but common for that ladder safety standard. Another real common one, the 7th most common category where we see OSHA violations written, is with regards to your forklift trucks, your powered industrial trucks. This comes from the standard 1910-178. And the most common reason an OSHA inspector is going to write a citation in here is because you don't have a part of your program that you can demonstrate that you have verified the competency of your operators. It is the employer's responsibility to make sure that forklift operators are trained and competent in that operation. So if you don't have a training program, and if you don't have a program in place for evaluating your forklift operators, that's a potential citation there. Operator evaluations occurring at least every 3 years is another common citation. Unsafe or not removing equipment from service if it's got some kind of defect or maintenance or mechanical problems that could render the forklift unsafe to operate. Not having your forklift operators trained or not having a training program in place for your operators. You think that might go kind of hand in hand with your competency, but in addition to operator training, you also have a responsibility to make sure that in addition to training that you do those hands-on evaluations. And so that's why we see kind of two aspects of the same area of your operator competency and operator training. And then the use of a daily safety checklist, that pre-trip inspection with a forklift that's pre-shift, that every time that forklift is brought out to be used for a new shift, it needs to have that safety inspection done on it. And this kind of goes hand in hand also with that unsafe or removed from service citation, because if you're doing a daily safety check, you should be removing that equipment from service when you identify those safety violations on the equipment. So that's a common cause for OSHA citations. Number 8 is machine guarding, and this can cover a whole wide variety of different topics. I threw into here some pictures I'll show you in a second of some common things that we see that fall under this as well. Machine guarding is in OSHA standard 1910-212. There's about 2,000 violations written on this one. And one would be, not having the appropriate protection from hazards on equipment. So not having one or more, guards in place to protect employees from exposure to a hazard on a piece of machinery. Not having a system in place to keep body or body parts out of a danger zone on equipment where someone could get entangled or crushed or whatever by a piece of equipment. Not having machinery properly anchored, so where the machinery could walk or tip, not having that anchored, that's another common violation in the machine guarding standard. Not having the guards securely affixed. Sometimes we remove the guards, like a common one would be on a table saw where we take the guard off because it's in the way, and then it just gets lost and it's not on there anymore. So we see these guards that are missing, and that's a common one, as well as if you have a fan, if you have fans in your shops or in any facilities, ceiling fans or any kind of fan that's moving air for ventilation in your facility, if those fan blades are within 7 feet of the ground or a walking area where employees are, there needs to be a guard or a cage around those fan blades, and that's a fairly common citation there as well. So this is what we see. This would be an example of the equipment that is not anchored, that could walk or tip. So this little drill press, you know, that you can see it's designed to be bolted down, but it's not. This is kind of a tabletop unit. It's really the ones we see a lot are the freestanding drill presses, you know, that are on the ground and they're tall, that aren't anchored. We see that a lot when we do our SAR inspections. A common one that we see is also not having a chuck guard on the drill press. And a lot of people have never even seen a chuck guard on a drill press, but a few years ago we noticed OSHA started writing citations to some of our members for not having these on their drill presses. So that's something to take a look at on your drill press. A super common one is your bench grinder. You know, you may be missing guards, or there may be adjustments that need to be made on your bench grinder. This is a very common cause of citation. You know, Evelyn Partner was here last month. We were talking to her one time, asking her what was, you know, one thing that she always knew she could write a citation on when she was a compliance inspector. And she said bench grinders. And so making sure that your tongue guards and your tool rests have the appropriate gaps adjustments on there, 1/8 of an inch between the tool rest and the stone, and 1/4 of an inch between the tongue guard up above the stone, as well as making sure they're anchored, making sure that we've got, you know, face shields in place, that your eye guards are in place, and that safety glasses are available. An important thing to remember on your bench grinders is that you are required to use both safety glasses and a full face shield when you're operating this equipment. Lots of times we have one or the other, but you're actually required to use both of those together. The next most common thing we see for OSHA violations is fall protection training, and they kind of broke this out in a separate one, because I know we had fall protection was #1, but they actually, in the documentation I found, they listed this training requirement on fall protection. They listed that totally separate. So that is like I think our #9 cause of OSHA citations is not having an appropriate training program associated with your fall protection program. And so that's training your employees on recognizing fall hazards where you know, there are requirements for specific types of PPE or fall protection or fall arrest systems, and so our employees need to be able to recognize those hazards. Training documentation is another common one. You might see this on other things besides just fall protection training, but specifically here, the OSHA inspectors, you know, when asking to see the documentation of the training, who conducted the training, who attended the training, you know, making sure that the training was the appropriate training to meet the standard, that's become a real common violation as well. So when you have the OSHA inspector coming in, you can expect them to ask to see potentially your training rosters and a description of what the training programs were. Training by a competent person. Again, I think this is less common, and remember, a competent person doesn't require a specific certification, but it does require that you be able to demonstrate that the person conducting the training has the body of knowledge and experience in order to conduct that training. You know, making sure that if we identify inadequacies in performance, that we retrain employees. So if you notice an employee failing to use their fall arrest system when they should be, for example, that employee needs to be retrained. And so you need to make sure that you can also document that you are retraining people when you identify deficiencies or inadequacies in their performance. And then just, you know, just a standard training on fall protection systems probably falls into some of these other categories, but that was listed separate on those 35 violations. And then finally, the 10th most common cause for an OSHA violation are electrical and wiring methods, 1910-305. And we actually see quite a few of these things as we go around doing SARs as well. You know, substitute for fixed wiring, in other words, using extension cords or other flexible cords in place of permanent wiring is a common citation. Splicing of your extension cords is another one that has a common violation. You know, taking that extension cord that's been damaged and, you know, doing a makeshift repair to it is going to be something that the OSHA inspector may notice quite a bit. Open blanks or boxes. So, you know, you may see where you have a panel box here, and, you know, this one's totally missing the cover altogether, but where the cover's in place, we shouldn't have any open holes also where we're missing a circuit breaker or you know, that should have a blank filling that hole so that things can't get in there, fingers or other objects that may be an electrocution hazard or a fire hazard. We want to make sure that these are covered. So also boxes, just you see down to the right of this circuit breaker panel here, there's just a regular 110 outlet box there that doesn't have a cover over it, or it could be a junction box that doesn't have a cover over it. So that's a common one as well, missing cover plates for outlet switches or for junction boxes. And then where you have it, you see at the bottom of this circuit breaker panel, you see that hole, you know, that's got the knockout open on it. And of course, if you're bringing a wire through that without any kind of a protection against that sharp edge there, that could be a potential violation where we are pulling wires around or against a sharp edge that could damage the insulation. That's a common violation as well. So just some other examples of things we see in that category. Here's a common one where you see that flexible cord being used in place of permanent wiring. You know, if you're punching holes through the wall or over doors, under windows, you know, to kind of permanently have that extension cord in there, that's probably going to be a violation of the standard. So, and that's something we see quite a bit of. Other things we see a lot as we do SARS is obstructions to emergency equipment like fire extinguishers or eye wash stations. And so also the documentation for regular inspections of your eye wash station, you know, something that we see quite a bit out there, where you have your compressed atmosphere cylinders, you know, gas cylinders, if they're not appropriately restrained. That's a common one we see a lot. Making sure that you have your oxidizers and your fuel gases separated, not stored together. They need to be at least 25 feet apart or have a fire break in between them. Here's a common one that goes with the fall protection thing we already talked about, but where we have these mezzanines or stairs that we've built up to mezzanines that don't have railings or don't have the appropriate railings. Here's a real good example of some nice railings there that we should have. Also combustible flammables, combustible and flammable storage, especially flammable liquids, flammable fuels, or other things that we have. If we've got large quantities of those, we need to make sure that those are appropriately stored. Making sure that we are keeping combustible materials stored away from ignition sources, such as electrical service panels, pilot lights, or other flames are things we need to be careful about. We see a lot of fuel gas cans that are either damaged, or they're older gas cans that don't meet, you know, a standard for a safety can, or we're storing large quantities of flammable fuels not in a flammables cabinet. So you got 5, 10, 20 gallons of gasoline sitting, you know, in your shop. That needs to be in a storage cabinet that's designed for storing those flammable fluids. So that's something to think about and take a look at. It's your gas cans and the amount of flammable fuels you have stored. Fire extinguishers is another common one. You know, sometimes we'll see an area that's got a fire extinguisher marked, but the fire extinguisher is missing. Sometimes it's, you know, the fire extinguisher, you know, isn't marked, it's there, but it's not identified. So there are standards on fire code that require that. Also, you know, making sure that your fire extinguisher is inspected annually. As you can see, this fire extinguisher has its pin and seal in place, but you can tell that the gauge is reading a recharge level there. So just because it hasn't been used doesn't mean it's ready to be used. So we need to make sure that our inspections are up to date, not just annual inspections, but monthly inspections that we do ourselves as well, to make sure those seals are in place, make sure the gauges are reading full, and that there's no obvious damage to those fire extinguishers, and that they're appropriately mounted and in an accessible location. Other things that we see real common are unexpected depressions or trip hazards. So just kind of look for that, either holes or things that we leave on the ground. Housekeeping is a really common one. So this, obviously, if we look in this area, an OSHA inspector is going to say, you know, this isn't going to a safe, you know, working and walking environment because of all the trip hazards here. So housekeeping is really important, making sure we keep cords and hoses stowed properly up off the floor. If they're not in use, let's get them off the floor. Let's employ hose reels and cord reels to help keep them off the floor so we don't have those trip hazards. Damaged electrical cords on equipment might be another common one that we see. So those give you some ideas places to start when you're looking at your shop and your work environments, to make sure that you are addressing those common issues that the OSHA inspector is likely to take a look at and maybe want to write you a citation on, or at least get you a corrective plan going in with those types of issues. So, Jason, any questions out there?
So, Doug, I saw a question on there about whether or not they need a written program for their powered industrial trucks. Do you want to address that?
Well, Jason or Brent,
yeah.
You're our certified trainer on forklifts. Why don't you address that one?
Yeah, I can do that. There is not actually a requirement to have that written program, but you do need to make sure, as Doug mentioned, that you have competent trainers and that you're doing your program every 3 years to reevaluate those operators. You want to make sure your operators are qualified to do that. And you can have that documentation in the form of certificate, cards, rosters, something that documents that they're authorized to use that. And that would serve as your documentation for that.
Excellent. So I take it we lost Jason.
No, I'm here. I just couldn't hit my button quick enough. I was actually just doing a little research there and got back to it. So I don't see any other questions on there, and we've gone a little while on that. If anybody's got a quick question, go ahead and type that in your chat box or the Q&A box. We'll let Doug give his final comments while we're waiting for that. Not seeing him. Doug?
Well, just kind of as a primer, Jason will be going into more depth on preparing for an OSHA inspection at 10 o'clock. So this is kind of, these two presentations today kind of go hand in hand. So especially for supervisors and managers, you may want to make sure you tune back in at 10 o'clock to get the rest of the story. If you have questions about any of these standards that were brought up, be sure to give us a call. In fact, here's our contact information, our office line, as well as our individual cell phone numbers and our email addresses there. So feel free to contact us with any questions you have regarding any of these potential OSHA violations or safety concerns. And remember, the most important thing to us is the safety, making sure that you have safe work environments and that we're not getting hurt, we're going home safe every day.
All right, thanks, Doug. Awesome overview. That's a great thing. Take this as a list, walk through your departments today, and check it out, and let's get ready, because like Doug said, it's all about keeping us safe, and that OSHA inspection is just the additional compliance level, but at the end of the day, we all want to be safe out on the job. Thanks so much, Doug. Great job. Doug will be back here at 9 o'clock and present this same topic. If you would like to watch it again, or if somebody missed this, missed signing up for that, make sure you send me an email and I can send you a hot link that will get you in. If you try to sign up through the regular method today, you won't get your login credentials in time for that. So just send me an email to jason@utahtrust.gov and we'll get you a link for that. All right, guys, everybody have a great day out there. Be safe. Make sure you clean that snow off your windshields, and those slippery shoes, throw them in the back of the closet. We want to have everybody go home safe and have an enjoyable winter. All right, be safe out there.